Good night. That's good. Are you ready for some stories, relaxation, and deep sleep? Good. That's why I'm here. I just wanted a very cozy night where I'm bundled up and I get to read you some stories from Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. I saw this book at Goodwill and I had to have it because it was so pretty. So I'm thinking that we're just going to open it up and flip to a random page. And that'll be the story that we read. How about you tell me when to stop? Okay. The Robber Bridegroom. There was once a miller who had a beautiful daughter, and when she was grown up, he became anxious that she should be well married and taken care of. So he thought, if a decent sort of man comes and asks her in marriage, I will give her to him. Soon after, a suitor came forward who seemed very well to do, and as the miller knew nothing to his disadvantage, he promised him his daughter. But the girl did not seem to love him as a bride should love her bridegroom. She had no confidence in him. As often as she saw him or thought about him, she felt a chill at her heart. One day he said to her, "You are to be my bride, and yet you have never been to see me." The girl answered, "I do not know where your house is." Then he said, "My house is a long way in the wood." She began to make excuses and said she could not find the way to it. But the bridegroom said, "You must come and pay me a visit next Sunday. I have already visited company, and I will strew ashes on the path through the wood so that you will be sure to find it." When Sunday came and the girl set out on her way, she felt very uneasy without knowing exactly why, and she filled both pockets full of peas and lentils. There were ashes strewn on the path through the wood, but nevertheless, at each step she cast to the right and left a few peas on the ground. So she went on the whole day until she came to the middle of the wood, where it was darkest, and there stood a lonely house, not pleasant in her eyes, for it was dismal and unhomelike. She walked in, but there was no one there, and the greatest stillness reigned. Suddenly she heard a voice cry, turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide." The girl glanced round and perceived that the voice came from a bird who was hanging in a cage by the wall. And again it cried, turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide." Then the pretty bride went on from one room into another through the whole house, but it was quite empty, and no soul to be found in it. At last she reached the cellar, and there sat a very old woman nodding her head. "Can you tell me," said the bride, "if my bridegroom lives here?" "Oh, poor child," answered the old woman, Do you know what has happened to you? You are in a place of cutthroats. You thought you were a bride and soon to be married, but death will be your spouse. Look here. I have a great kettle of water to set on, and once they have you in their power, they will cut you in pieces without mercy, cook you and eat you, for they are cannibals. Unless I have pity on you and save you, all is over with you. Then the old woman hid her behind a great cask where she could not be seen. Be as still as a mouse, she said. Do not move or go away, or else you are lost. At night, when the robbers are asleep, we will escape. I have been waiting a long time for this opportunity. No sooner was it settled than the wicked king entered the house. They brought another young woman with them, dragging her along, and they were drunk. They would not listen to her cries and groans. They gave her wine to drink, 3 glasses full, one of white wine, one of red, and one of yellow, and then they cut her in pieces, the poor bride, all the while shaking and trembling when she saw what a fate the robbers had intended. One of them noticed on the little finger of their victim a golden ring, and as he could not draw it off easily, he took an axe and chopped it off. But the finger jumped away and fell behind the cask on the bride's lap. The robber took up a light to look for it, but he could not find it. Then said one of the others, "Have you looked behind the great cask?" But the old woman cried, "Come to supper and leave off looking till tomorrow. The finger cannot run away." Then the robber said the old woman was right, and they left off searching and sat down to eat. And the old woman dropped some sleeping stuff into their wine, so that before long they stretched themselves on the cellar floor, sleeping and snoring. When the bride heard that, she came from behind the cask and had to make her way among the sleepers lying all about on the ground. And she felt very afraid, lest she might awaken any of them. But by good luck she passed through, and the old woman with her, and they opened the door, and they made haste to leave. The wind had carried away the ashes from the path, but the peas and lentils had bud and sprung up, and the moonshine upon them showed the way. And they went on through the night, till in the morning they reached the mill. Then the girl related to her father all that had happened to her. When the wedding day came, the friends and neighbors assembled, the miller having invited them, and the bridegroom also appeared. When they were all seated at table, each one had to tell a story, but the bride sat still and said nothing, till at last the bridegroom said to her, "Now, sweetheart, do you know no story? Tell us something." She answered, "I will tell you my dream. I was going alone through a wood, and I came at last to a house in which there was no living soul. But by the wall was a bird in a cage who cried, turn back, thou pretty bride. Within this house thou must not bide, for here do evil things betide." And then again it said it, "Sweetheart, the dream is not ended." Then I went through all the rooms, and they were all empty, and it was so lonely and wretched. At last I went down into the cellar, and there sat an old woman, nodding her head. I asked her if my bridegroom lived in that house, and she answered, "Ah, poor child, you have come into a place of cutthroats. Your bridegroom does not live here, but he will kill you and cut you into pieces, and then cook you and eat you. "Sweetheart, the dream is not ended." But the old woman hid me behind a great cask, and no sooner had she done so than the robbers came home, dragging them a young woman, and they gave her a drink, wine thrice white, red, and yellow. "Sweetheart, the dream is not yet ended." And then they killed her and cut her in pieces. "Sweetheart, my dream is not yet ended." And one of the robbers saw a gold ring on her finger, and as it was difficult to get off, he took an axe and chopped off the finger, which jumped upwards and then fell behind the great cask on my lap. And here is the finger with the ring. As these words, she drew it forth and showed it to the company. The robber, who during the story had grown deadly white, sprang up and would have escaped, but the folks held him fast and delivered him up to justice, and he and his whole gang were, for their evil deeds, condemned and executed. I never once said that these were happy, sweet stories, okay, just to be fair. Also, I have not read any of these stories, okay? Okay, I'll try to find a happy one. All right. The Elf. There was once upon a time a rich king who had 3 daughters, who daily went to walk in the palace garden. The king was a great lover of all kinds of fine trees, but there was one for which he had such an affection that if anyone gathered an apple from it, he wished him 100 fathoms underground. And when harvest time came, the apples on the tree were all as red as blood. The 3 daughters went every day beneath the tree and looked to see if the wind had not blown down an apple. But they never by any chance found one, and the tree was so loaded with them that it was almost breaking, and the branches hung down to the ground. The king's youngest child had a great desire for an apple and said to her sisters, Our father loves us far too much to wish us underground. It is my belief that he would only do that to people who were strangers." And while she was speaking, the child plucked off quite a large apple and ran to her sisters, saying, "Just taste, my dear little sisters, for never in my life have I tasted anything so delightful." Then the 2 other sisters also ate some of the apple, whereupon all 3 sank deep down into the earth, where they could hear no cock crow. When midday came, the king wished to call them to come to dinner, but they were nowhere to be found. He sought them everywhere in the palace and garden, but could not find them. Then he was much troubled and made known to the whole land that whoever brought his daughters back again should have one of them to wife. Hereupon so many young men went about the country in search, and there was no counting them, for everyone loved the 3 children because they were so kind to all and so fair of face. 3 young huntsmen also went out, and when they had traveled about for 8 days, they arrived at a great castle in which were beautiful apartments, and in one room a table was laid, on which were delicate dishes, which were still so warm that they were smoking. But in the whole of the castle no human being was either to be seen or heard. They waited there for half a day, and the food still remained warm and smoking. And at length they were so hungry that they sat down and ate, and agreed with each other that they stay alive in the castle, and that one of them should be chosen by casting lots, should remain in the house, and the 2 others seek the king's daughters. They cast lots, and the lot fell on the eldest. So next day the 2 younger went out to seek, and the eldest had to stay at home. At midday came a small mannikin and begged for a piece of bread. Then the husband took the bread which he had found there and cut a round off the loaf and was about to give it to him. But while he was giving it to the mannikin, the latter let it fall and asked the husband to be so good as to give him that piece again. The husband was about to do so and stopped, on which the mannikin took a stick, seized him by the hair, and gave him a good beating. Next day the second stayed at home, and he feared no better. When the 2 others returned in the evening, the eldest said, "Well, how have you got on?" "Oh, very badly," said he. And then they lamented their misfortune together, but said nothing about it to the youngest, for they did not like him at all, and always called him Stupid Hans, because he did not exactly belong to the forest. On the 3rd day, the youngest stayed at home, and again the little mannikin came and begged for a piece of bread. When the youth gave it to him, the elf let it fall as before, and asked him to be so good as to give him that piece again. Then said Hans to the little mannikin, "What? Canst thou not pick up that piece thyself, if thou wilt not take as much trouble as that for thy daily bread? Thou dost not deserve to have it." Then the mannikin grew very angry and said he was to do it, but the husband would not, and took my dear mannikin and gave him a thorough beating. Then the mannikin screamed terribly and cried, "Stop, stop, and let me go, and I will tell thee where the king's daughters are." When Hans heard that, he left off beating him, and the mannikin told him that he was an earth mannikin, and that there were more than 1,000 like him, and that if he would go with him, he would show him where the king's daughters were. Then he showed him a deep well, but there was no water in it, and the elf said that he knew well that the companions Hans had with him did not intend to deal honorably with him. Therefore he wished to deliver the king's children. He must do it alone. The 2 other brothers would also be very glad to recover the king's daughters, but they did not want to have any trouble or danger. Hans was therefore to take a large basket, and he must seat himself in it with his hanger and a bell, and be let down. Below were 3 rooms, and in each of them was a princess with a many-headed dragon, whose heads she was to comb and trim, but he must cut them off. And having said all this, the elf vanished. When it was evening, the 2 brothers came and asked how he had got on. And he said pretty well so far, and that he had seen no one except at midday, when a little mannikin had come who had begged for a piece of bread, that he had given some to him, but that the mannikin had let it fall and had asked him to pick it up again. But as he did not choose to do that, the elf had begun to lose his temper, and that he had done what he ought not, and had given the elf a beating, on which he had told him where the king's daughters were. Then the 2 were so angry at this that they grew green and yellow. Next morning they went to the well together and drew lots who should first seat himself in the basket, and again the lot fell on the eldest, and he was to seat himself in it and take the bell with him. Then he said, "If I ring, you must draw me up again immediately." When he had gone down for a short distance, he rang, and they at once drew him up again. Then the second seated himself in the basket, and he did just the same as the first. And then it was the turn of the youngest. But he let himself be lowered quite to the bottom. When he had got out of the basket, he took his hanger and went and stood outside the first door and listened, and heard the dragon snoring quite loudly. He opened the door slowly, and one of the princesses was sitting there, and had 9 dragons' heads lying upon her lap, and was combing them. Then he took his hanger and hewed at them, and the 9 fell off. The princess sprang up, threw her arms around his neck, embraced and kissed him repeatedly, and took her stomacher, which was made of red gold, and hung it around his neck. Then he went to the second princess, who had a dragon with 5 heads to comb, and delivered her also. And to the youngest, who had a dragon with 4 heads, he went likewise. And they all rejoiced and embraced him and kissed him without stopping. Then he rang very loud, so that those above heard him, and he placed the princesses one after the other in the basket, and had them all drawn up. But when it came to his own turn, he remembered the words of the elf, who had told him that his comrades did not mean well by him. So he took a great stone which was lying there, and placed it in the basket. And when it was about halfway up, his false brothers above cut the rope, so that the basket with the stone fell to the ground. And they thought that he was dead, and ran away with the 3 princesses, making them promise to tell their father that it was they who had delivered them. And then they went to the king, and each demanded a princess in marriage. In the meantime, the youngest huntsman was wandering about the 3 chambers in great trouble, fully expecting to end his days there, when he saw hanging on the wall a flute. I used to play the flute. Then he said, the dragons had likewise, and said, you cannot help me now. He walked backwards and forwards for such a long time that he made the surface of the ground quite smooth. At last other thoughts came to his mind, and he took the flute from the wall and played a few notes on it. And suddenly a number of elves appeared, and with every note that he sounded, one more came. He played until the room was entirely filled. They all asked what he desired. So he said he wished to get above ground back to daylight, on which they seized him by every hair that grew on his head, and thus they flew with him on the earth again. When he was above ground, he at once went to King's palace, just as the wedding of one princess was about to be celebrated, and he went to the room where the king and his 3 daughters were. When the princesses saw him, they fainted. Hereupon the king was angry, and have done some injury to the children. When the princesses came to themselves, however, they entreated the king to set him free again. The king asked why, and they said that they were not allowed to tell that, but their father said that they were to tell it to the stove. And he went out, listened at the door, and heard everything. Then he caused the 2 brothers to be hanged on the gallows, and to the 3rd he gave his youngest daughter. And on that occasion I wore a pair of glass shoes, and I struck them against a stone, and they said clink, and were broken. Interesting. Let's try to find some that aren't as long. There's some short ones in here. Here we go. The ear of corn. In former times, when God Himself still walked the earth, the fruitfulness of soil was much greater than it is now. Then the ears of corn did not bear 50 or 60 before, or 500-fold. Then the corn grew from the bottom to the very top of the stalk, and according to the length of the stalk was the length of the ear. Men, however, are so made that when they are too well off, they no longer value the blessings which come from God, but grow indifferent and careless. One day a woman was passing by a cornfield when her little child, who was running beside her, fell into a puddle and dirtied her frock. On this the mother tore up a handful of the beautiful ears of corn and cleaned the frock with them. When the Lord, who just came by, saw that, he was angry and said, "Henceforth shall the stalks of corn bear no more ears. Men are no longer worthy of heavenly gifts." The bystanders who heard this were terrified and fell on their knees and prayed that he would still leave something on the stalks, even if the people were undeserving of it, for the sake of the innocent birds which would otherwise have to starve. The Lord, who foresaw their suffering, had pity on them and granted the request, so the ears were left as they now grow. Let's do two more. The willful child. Once upon a time there was a child who was willful and would not do what her mother wished. For this reason God had no pleasure in her and let her become ill, and no doctor could do her any good. And in a short time she lay on her deathbed. When she had been lowered into her grave and the earth was spread over her, all at once her arm came out again and stretched upward. And when they had put it in and spread fresh earth over it, it was all to no purpose, for the arm always came out again. Then the mother herself was obliged to go to the grave and strike the arm with a rod. And when she had done that, it was drawn in. And then at last the child had rest beneath the ground. The rose. There was once a poor woman who had 2 children. The youngest had to go every day into the forest to fetch wood. Once, when she had gone a long way to seek, a little child who was quite strong came and helped her industriously to pick up the wood and carry it home. And then before a moment had passed, the strange child disappeared. The child told her mother this, but at first she would not believe it. At length she brought a rose home and told her mother that the beautiful child had given her this rose and had told her that when it was in full bloom, he would return. The mother put the rose in water one morning. One morning her child could not get out of bed. The mother went to the bed and found her dead, but looking very happy. On the same morning, the rose was in full bloom. So, I know those weren't super happy stories, but they're my kind of stories. And I enjoyed them. They're neat, they're unique. Not all fairy tales have a happy ending. I really appreciate you, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Please let me know if this is something you would like to see more of. And if you like, maybe I'll do some happy, relaxing stories. I still found them relaxing. All right, you guys. I'll see you in the next one. Good night, my insomniac.